You ever notice how the quietest man in the room is the one everyone underestimates until he speaks? The glass door slid open with a soft whisper, and every head turned just long enough to register him, then just as quickly turned away, dismissing him like a smudge on polished chrome. Ethan Cole stepped inside the executive assessment room wearing a faded navy shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows, and a pair of worn leather shoes that had seen better years, the kind of man you'd expect to fix something, not lead it. Next candidate. Ethan Cole. The coordinator called, her voice neutral, but the room had already made its decision. A low chuckle broke from the far end of the table, sharp and easy, the kind that didn't ask permission. You here to clean up after us? Or did you take a wrong elevator? Ryan Brooks leaned back in his chair, cufflinks catching the overhead light, a smile curling at the edge of his lips as a few others joined in, softer but no less certain. Ethan didn't answer right away. He walked forward at an even pace, each step measured, quiet, his gaze steady but not confrontational, like a man who had learned long ago that dignity didn't need an audience. The room smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood, the hum of recessed lighting filling the silence between the laughter. Victoria Hale sat at the head of the table, fingers lightly pressed together, watching, not amused, not impressed, just observing, as if she were waiting for something the others couldn't see. Seats over there, Ryan added, gesturing casually to the far end, the one slightly off from the others, just enough to make a point. Unless you prefer standing. A few more smiles flickered. Ethan reached the chair, pulled it out without a sound, and sat down, posture straight but relaxed, hands resting lightly on the table, eyes forward. No apology. No explanation. Just presence. Let's try to keep this professional, Victoria said calmly, though her tone carried no real reprimand, only a subtle shift that quieted the room by a degree. Papers shuffled. Laptops opened. The air tightened. You're here for the CEO's strategic assessment, she continued, her gaze finally settling on Ethan for a fraction longer than necessary. This process isn't about titles or appearances. It's about clarity, judgment, and truth. Ethan gave a small nod. Understood. His voice was low, even, the kind that didn't compete with noise but somehow carried through it. Ryan smirked again, leaning toward the candidate beside him. This should be interesting, he muttered under his breath, just loud enough. Across the glass walls, the city stretched out in clean lines and sharp edges, a world built on decisions made in rooms like this, by people who believed they knew exactly what power looked like. Inside, the test packets were placed in front of each candidate, thick, deliberate, designed to expose hesitation and reward confidence. Pins clicked. Chairs adjusted. The game had begun. And still, no one in that room. Not the polished executives, not the confident contenders, not even the woman at the head of the table, knew who Ethan Cole really was. But they were about to learn, in the one language that couldn't be laughed off. Silence. The papers in front of them were not just questions, they were carefully constructed pressure points, each page layered with projections, market shifts, risk variables, and incomplete data designed to force instinct into the open. And for a moment the room moved in unison as if rehearsed, pages turning, pens tapping, the quiet confidence of people who had spent their lives being right. You have 45 minutes, Victoria said, her voice even, controlled, the kind that did not need to rise to command attention, and the timer on the far screen began its silent countdown. Ryan leaned back slightly before leaning forward again, already scribbling, his pen moving quickly, almost theatrically, as if speed itself were proof of intelligence. Classic misdirection, he murmured to the man beside him, not bothering to lower his voice. They want to see who overcomplicates it. A few nods followed, small alliances forming across polished wood and tailored suits. Ethan did not move at first. His eyes rested on the first page, not scanning, not rushing, just taking it in, line by line, as though he were listening rather than reading. The hum of the lights seemed louder here, or maybe it was the silence between breaths, the kind that stretches when people are trying to prove something. He turned the page slowly. No urgency, no performance. Across the room, someone whispered numbers under their breath. Another began sketching a flowchart, arrows and boxes forming a maze of logic that looked impressive from a distance. You are missing the supply chain constraint, one candidate said quietly, leaning toward another. It is not demand, it is distribution. No, came the reply, sharper now. It is leadership failure at the top level. The conversation stayed just below the line of interruption, competitive but contained, like a storm building behind glass. Ethan's pen finally touched the paper. One line, then another. Not paragraphs, not diagrams, just short, deliberate notes, spaced out like he was leaving room for something unseen. Victoria watched that, her gaze shifting briefly from the louder minds to the quiet one at the far end, the one who did not seem interested in winning the room. She tapped her pen once against her folder, a small, thoughtful rhythm, then stilled again. Ryan glanced over, catching sight of Ethan's near-empty page, and smirked. You might want to start writing something, he said, his tone light but edged. They do not grade on imagination. A soft ripple of amusement followed, not loud enough to break the rules, but enough to carry. Ethan lifted his eyes, meeting Ryan's for just a second, calm, unbothered. I am, he said simply. Then he looked back down. No defense, no explanation, just that. The timer continued its quiet march. 30 minutes left. The room grew warmer, not in temperature but in tension, shoulders tightening, movements becoming sharper, confidence beginning to fracture at the edges as the problem refused to settle into something clean. One candidate erased an entire page. Another sighed, long and controlled, before starting over. The illusion of certainty was thinning. Ethan turned another page, then stopped, his pen resting in place as if he had reached the center of something. Not the answer yet, but the question beneath the question. He leaned back, slightly, eyes unfocused for a brief moment, not searching outward, but inward, like someone remembering rather than calculating. Across the glass wall, a plane traced a thin white line across the sky, distant and steady, indifferent to the pressure inside the room. Victoria followed his stillness for a beat longer than before. Everyone else was trying to solve the problem. He was trying to understand why it existed. And that difference, though no one said it yet, was beginning to matter. The timer dropped below 20 minutes, and the room no longer moved in quiet confidence, but in restless adjustment, chairs shifting, fingers tapping faster, the earlier certainty dissolving into something tighter, something more fragile. This does not make sense, one candidate whispered, rubbing his temple as he scanned the projections again. The margins collapse no matter how you scale it. Then you are scaling it wrong, Ryan replied quickly, though his tone carried a flicker of strain now, his pen no longer gliding but pressing harder against the paper. You optimize distribution, you offset the loss. That only delays it, another voice added from across the table. It does not fix the core issue. The discussion grew sharper, not louder, but edged with urgency, each person defending their angle, each solution layered with complexity, as if adding more would somehow make it whole. Flowcharts expanded, numbers circled, arrows redirected, but the problem held its ground, unmoved. Ethan remained still. His paper was no longer empty, but it was far from crowded, a handful of lines, a few numbers, and one sentence written slightly darker than the rest, underlined once. Not for emphasis, but for clarity. He read it again, not to check it, but to feel it, the way a carpenter might run his hand along a finished edge, not to see, but to know. Ryan glanced over again, unable to ignore the contrast any longer. You still on page 1? He asked, a faint laugh following, though it did not land as easily this time. We are halfway through, just so you know. Ethan looked up briefly, calm as before. I know. Good, Ryan said, leaning back with a small shake of his head. Would not want you to run out of time. A few quiet smiles returned, thinner now, less certain, like echoes of something that had already begun to fade. Across the table, a woman in a charcoal suit closed her eyes for a second, then reopened them, staring at her notes as if willing them to change. It is not a growth problem, she said slowly, almost to herself. It is a structure problem. No one answered. Not because they disagreed, but because no one could yet prove her wrong or right. Victoria's pen tapped once again, then stopped. Her gaze moved across the room, tracking the subtle shifts, the tightening jaws, the forced composure, the quiet unraveling of polished confidence. Then it returned to Ethan. He was not unraveling. He was not even tightening. He was simply steady, like someone who had already stepped outside the noise. The timer blinked 15 minutes. The air felt heavier now, not from heat, but from expectation pressing down on every decision, every line written or erased. One candidate flipped back 3 pages, another crossed out an entire section with a single firm stroke, the sound of it louder than it should have been. Ryan exhaled slowly, adjusting his cuffs, then leaned forward again, determined, his movements sharper, more deliberate, as if effort alone could bend the outcome. Ethan picked up his pen once more and added a final line beneath the others, short, direct, almost simple to the point of risk. He paused, then drew a small box around it. Not decorative, just contained. His eyes lifted from the page and rested on the center of the table, not on anyone in particular, but on the space where all their ideas seemed to collide and cancel each other out. He did not look impressed. He did not look concerned. He looked finished, and in a room still searching for answers, that quiet completion felt almost out of place, almost invisible, and yet, somehow, it carried more weight than all the noise combined. The timer slipped under 10 minutes, and something in the room shifted from pressure to urgency, the kind that made even the most confident hands hesitate for a fraction too long. Final answers in 10, the coordinator announced, her voice steady, but the effect was immediate. Shoulders straightened, pens moved faster, eyes narrowed as if clarity could be forced in the final stretch. Ryan leaned forward, scanning his pages again, lips pressed thin, then added another note, then another, layering solution on top of solution as though complexity itself might earn approval. It is about leverage, he said quietly, more to himself now than anyone else. You reposition the risk, you hedge the downside. Across from him, another candidate shook her head slightly. That still assumes the model is stable, she replied, her tone controlled but strained. What if the model is broken from the start? No one answered, not because they disagreed, but because no one had the time to unravel that possibility. Ethan sat unmoving for a moment longer, his pen resting lightly between his fingers, his eyes no longer on the paper, but somewhere beyond it, as if the numbers in front of him had already served their purpose. He closed the folder gently, not with finality, but with quiet certainty, and placed both hands on the table, fingers relaxed, posture unchanged. The movement was subtle, but Victoria noticed it immediately. Her gaze lingered, sharper now, more focused, as though something she had been waiting for had just arrived without announcement. 5 minutes, the coordinator added, and the room responded with a final surge, pages flipping, lines being underlined, small corrections made in haste, the last attempt to turn effort into outcome. Ryan exhaled through his nose, then capped his pen with a decisive click, leaning back with a faint nod, as if convincing himself that he had done enough. He glanced sideways again, expecting to see the same stillness, and found it. Ethan was not writing. He was not reviewing. He was simply sitting there, calm, present, as if the result no longer depended on anything in front of him. You done already? Ryan asked, unable to keep the edge from his voice this time. Ethan turned his head slightly. Yes. Must be nice, Ryan said with a thin smile. Or risky. Ethan held his gaze for a second, not challenging, not defensive, just steady. Only if you were guessing. The words were quiet, almost gentle, but they landed with a weight that lingered a moment too long. Ryan's smile faded by a degree, replaced by something tighter, something less certain, though he said nothing more. The final seconds counted down in silence now. No more whispers, no more exchanges, just the soft hum of the room and the faint ticking on the screen. Time, the coordinator said, and hands pulled back, pens set down, answers surrendered to whatever judgment would follow. Victoria stood slowly, gathering the folders one by one, her movements deliberate, unhurried, as if the pace itself was part of the evaluation. She paused briefly at Ethan's seat, her fingers resting on the edge of his paper for a fraction longer than necessary before lifting it. No comment, no reaction, just observation. She returned to the head of the table, placing the stack in front of her, then looked up at the group, her expression composed, unreadable. We will review your responses, she said evenly. But before we do, I want to hear your reasoning. A subtle shift rippled through the room, anticipation replacing tension. One by one, she continued. You will walk us through your strategy. Not what you wrote, but why you wrote it. She paused, letting the weight of that settle. "Mr. Brooks," she said, turning her gaze slightly. "Let us begin with you." Ryan straightened, confidence returning in form if not fully in substance, his hand resting lightly on his folder as he prepared to speak, unaware that somewhere down the line, in a voice no one was expecting to matter, the entire room was about to be brought to a stop. Ryan adjusted his posture before he spoke, shoulders squared, chin slightly raised, the confidence returning to his voice like a well-practiced rhythm. "The issue presented is not a failure of demand, but a misalignment of capital deployment," he began, his tone smooth, controlled, each word placed with intention. He stood, walking slowly toward the screen, one hand gesturing lightly as he spoke. "What we are seeing is an overextension of resources into unstable distribution channels. The logical response is not retreat, but strategic redirection." He tapped the edge of the table once, emphasizing the point. "You reinforce your strongest sectors, cut losses early, and leverage scale to absorb volatility." A few nods followed, subtle but supportive, the room leaning into familiarity, into language that sounded like authority. Victoria did not interrupt. She watched, eyes steady, expression unchanged, as Ryan continued layering his explanation, each point building on the last, polished, structured, impressive in form. "In short," he concluded, offering a small, confident smile, "you do not fix the system by questioning it. You optimize it." Silence followed, but not the heavy kind, just a pause of acknowledgement. "Thank you," Victoria said evenly, making a small note on her paper. Next, one by one, the others followed, each presentation echoing a similar pattern, different angles, different terminology, but the same underlying assumption that the system itself was sound, that the problem existed within its execution, not its foundation. Voices rose and fell, confident, analytical, controlled, each candidate trying to out-clarify the last, to refine the same idea into something sharper, something more convincing. Ethan remained seated, hands folded loosely, eyes forward, listening without interruption, without reaction, as if each explanation confirmed something he had already decided. The air shifted gradually, not in noise, but in weight, as repetition began to reveal itself, not as agreement, but as limitation. Victoria closed the final folder and placed it gently on the table. Her gaze moved once across the room, measuring, considering, then stopped. "Mr. Cole," she said. The name landed softly, but it carried through the space with unexpected clarity. A brief flicker of amusement crossed someone's face, quickly suppressed. Ryan leaned back slightly, arms folding, curiosity now mixed with quiet expectation. Ethan lifted his eyes, meeting Victoria's gaze, then stood. No rush, no hesitation, just a simple movement, as if this moment had been waiting for him rather than the other way around. He did not walk to the screen. He did not gather his papers. He simply rested one hand lightly on the back of his chair and spoke from where he stood. "They are not wrong," he said calmly. A few eyebrows lifted. "Everything they said would work," he continued, his voice steady, unforced, "if the system itself was not the problem." A pause. Not long, but enough. The room stilled by a degree. Ryan's posture shifted slightly, his arms loosening, attention sharpening. Ethan's gaze moved briefly across the table, not challenging, not defensive, just acknowledging. "You are all trying to optimize a structure that is designed to fail under its own assumptions," he said. No emphasis, no dramatics, just clarity. The words did not hit loudly, but they did not disappear either. They settled. And for the first time since the test began, no one reached for their pen, no one adjusted their notes, no one filled the space with sound. Because something in what he said did not invite interruption. It invited understanding. And that was where the room began to change. No one spoke, not because they agreed, but because they did not yet know how to disagree. Ethan did not rush to fill that silence. He let it sit, let it breathe, his hand still resting lightly on the chair, his posture unchanged, as if he had simply placed a truth on the table and trusted it to stand on its own. Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly, not in skepticism, but in focus. "Explain," she said, her voice calm, but carrying a new weight now, one that did not invite performance, only clarity. Ethan gave a small nod. The model assumes growth will stabilize loss. He began, his tone even, measured, but the cost structure expands faster than the revenue can compensate for. That is not a scaling problem. That is a design flaw. He stepped forward slightly, not toward the screen, but just enough to shift his presence into the center of the room. You are all trying to protect the output, he continued, his gaze moving briefly across the table, but no one is questioning the input. A pause. Short. Intentional. The system rewards volume over efficiency. So the more you grow, the more you lose. A few candidates glanced down at their notes, scanning quickly, as if searching for something they might have missed. Ryan leaned forward now, elbows on the table, his earlier confidence replaced with a sharper attention. That is not entirely accurate, he said, his voice controlled, but tighter than before. You can offset that with margin optimization. Ethan met his eyes briefly. Only if your margins are real, he replied. No edge, no challenge, just fact. The words hung there, simple, almost quiet, but they did not leave room for comfort. Ethan continued before anyone else could step in. The projections you were given, he said, tapping lightly on the table near the stack of folders. They assumed fixed efficiency gains across all channels. That is not how real systems behave. Efficiency drops as complexity increases. Always. His voice never rose, never pushed, but each sentence seemed to remove something from the room, a layer of assumption, a piece of certainty. So you compensate, he went on. You add more capital, more distribution, more layers to manage the loss. He paused again, just long enough for the pattern to become visible. And that, he said quietly, is where it breaks. No one moved. No one interrupted. Even the small sounds, the shifting chairs, the tapping pens, had disappeared. Victoria stepped slightly forward, her attention fixed completely now. So what would you do, she asked. The question was simple, but the room felt it. Ethan did not answer immediately. He glanced once at the papers in front of them, then back up, as if confirming something already settled in his mind. You do not fix it, he said. A ripple of confusion crossed a few faces. Ryan frowned slightly. Then what? Ethan's expression did not change. You rebuild it, he said. The words landed without force, but they carried something heavier than argument. Not a suggestion, not a theory, a conclusion. And in that moment, something shifted completely. Because this was no longer about solving a problem. It was about admitting that everything they had assumed might have been wrong. The words did not echo, but they did not disappear either. They stayed, suspended in the air, heavier than anything that had been said before, and for a moment no one moved, as if the room itself was deciding whether to accept them or reject them. Ryan leaned back slowly, his expression tightening, not dismissive, but unsettled. Rebuild it, he repeated, a faint edge creeping into his voice. That is not a strategy. That is an admission of failure. A few subtle nods followed, not confident, but searching for something familiar to hold on to. Ethan did not react. He did not defend the statement. He simply looked at Ryan, steady, patient, like a man who had already walked this road before. Only if you think the goal is to protect what already exists, he said quietly. The sentence landed differently, not as a challenge, but as a mirror. Ryan opened his mouth slightly, then stopped, the response forming but not settling. Across the table, someone shifted in their seat. Another glanced down at their notes again, but the pages no longer offered answers, only reminders of how certain they had been just minutes ago. Victoria took a slow step forward, her heels making a soft, measured sound against the floor, and for the first time since the session began, she did not look at the group as a whole. She looked only at Ethan. Walk me through it, she said. Not a request for explanation. A request for truth. Ethan gave a small nod, his gaze dropping briefly to the table before returning to her. You start by removing the assumption that growth equals success, he said. His voice remained calm, but something in it had shifted, not louder, not stronger, just clearer. You measure stability first. Efficiency second. Growth last. He paused, letting the order settle. If the system cannot sustain itself at a small scale, expanding it only accelerates the failure. The room stayed silent, but it was no longer the silence of dismissal. It was attention, focused, unbroken. So you strip it down, he continued, his hand moving slightly now, not to perform, but to outline something invisible. You reduce complexity. You remove channels that do not produce real value. You rebuild around what actually works, not what looks good on paper. A candidate across the table frowned slightly, then nodded almost without realizing it. Another leaned forward, eyes narrowing, not in disagreement, but in recognition. Ryan said, "Nothing." His earlier confidence had not collapsed, but it had shifted, turning inward, reassessing, recalculating. Ethan's voice softened by a degree, not in uncertainty, but in restraint. "Most people think leadership is about making something bigger," he said. "It is not." A brief pause. "It is about knowing what to let go of." The words settled deeper than the others, quieter, but more permanent. Victoria's expression did not change, but her posture did, just slightly, the smallest shift of weight, the kind that happens when something aligns with something unspoken. She did not look at her notes. She did not look at the other candidates. She only watched him. And around them, the room, once filled with quiet laughter and confident noise, had become something else entirely. Not impressed, not convinced, just still. Because in that moment, no one was thinking about winning anymore. They were thinking about whether everything they had built their confidence on was something they were finally seeing clearly for the first time. And no one knew what to say next. No one rushed to respond. The silence did not feel empty anymore. It felt full, like something had finally settled in a place that no one wanted to disturb too quickly. Victoria held his gaze for a moment longer, then turned slightly, her attention shifting to the stack of folders in front of her. She opened one, then another, scanning quickly, not for answers, but for alignment, as if comparing what had been written to what had just been said. Her fingers paused on a page, then she looked back up. "Where did you learn to see it that way?" she asked, her tone quieter now, not skeptical, but genuinely curious. The question lingered in the air, softer than the others, but somehow more personal. Ethan did not answer immediately. His eyes dropped briefly, not to avoid the question, but to consider it, as if the answer was not something simple enough to hand over without care. "I built something once," he said finally. The room leaned in, not physically, but in attention. "It worked," he continued, his voice steady, without pride. For a while, a faint shift moved across a few faces, subtle, almost imperceptible. "We scaled fast," he said, "faster than we understood." He paused, just long enough for the meaning to settle. And then it stopped working. No dramatics, no blame, just fact. Ryan's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough, the edge softening into something more measured, more respectful, though he did not speak. Ethan continued, his tone unchanged. "Not because the idea was wrong," he said, "but because we built on assumptions we never questioned." His gaze lifted again, meeting Victoria's. "We thought growth would solve everything. It did not." The words carried no bitterness, only clarity, the kind that comes after something has already been lost and understood. "So you walked away," Victoria said quietly. It was not a guess. Ethan gave a small nod. "I stayed long enough to understand what we missed," he replied. "Then I left." A faint exhale moved through the room, not loud, but shared, the kind that comes when a story does not need to be explained in full to be understood. One of the candidates shifted slightly in their seat, their earlier posture of certainty now replaced with something more grounded, more aware. Victoria closed the folder in her hand and set it down with care. "Most people would have tried to fix it," she said. Ethan's expression remained calm. "We did," he answered. A brief pause. "We just kept fixing the wrong things." The sentence landed quietly, but it did not leave the room. It stayed, like everything else he had said, not forcing agreement, but making it harder to ignore what had already been seen. Victoria stepped back slightly, her posture straight, composed, but something in her presence had shifted, not in authority, but in recognition. She was no longer evaluating him in the same way. The room felt it, even if no one named it. Ryan glanced down at his notes again, then closed his folder slowly, the earlier confidence replaced with something quieter, something more reflective. No one laughed now. No one whispered. No one tried to reclaim the moment, because it was already gone, replaced by something else entirely. Not defeat, not victory, just understanding. And in that understanding, something rare had happened. The room that once judged him without hesitation was now listening without interruption. And no one needed to say why. Victoria did not speak immediately. She stood there for a moment, looking at Ethan not as a candidate, not as a name on a list, but as someone who had already answered questions no one else in the room had thought to ask. Then she took a slow breath and placed both hands lightly on the table. "We are done here," she said quietly. The words were simple, but they carried finality, not of dismissal, but of conclusion. A few candidates shifted, surprised, unsure if something had been skipped or if something had already been decided. Ryan straightened slightly, his expression controlled, but his eyes moved once more toward Ethan, no longer measuring, no longer amused, just acknowledging. Victoria gathered the folders into a neat stack, then looked back up. This assessment was never about finding the most polished answer, she continued, her voice steady, measured. It was about seeing who understood the question beneath the question. She paused briefly, letting that settle. "Most of you tried to improve what was given," she said. "One of you questioned whether it should exist at all." Her gaze moved, not dramatically, just enough. It did not need to land anywhere specific for everyone to know where it had already been. The room remained still. No one argued. No one attempted to reclaim ground, because there was nothing left to compete over. Victoria stepped around the table, closing the distance by a few quiet steps. "Mr. Cole," she said, her tone unchanged, but carrying something new beneath it, something closer to respect than evaluation. "I would like to offer you a position." A subtle shift moved through the room, not loud, not visible, but felt, like the moment before a sound that never comes. Ethan looked at her, his expression calm, unchanged, as if the words did not surprise him, but also did not define anything for him. "It would not be entry level," she added. "You would be leading the restructure directly." The offer hung there, clear, direct, significant. Ryan's jaw tightened slightly, not in resentment, but in recognition of something he could not contest. A few others lowered their eyes, not in defeat, but in quiet acceptance. Ethan glanced down for a brief moment, his hand moving toward the edge of the table, then stopping, as if remembering something more important than the room he was standing in. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, the screen lighting up softly as he looked at it for just a second longer than necessary. A small photo. A little girl, smiling, missing one front tooth, holding a drawing up to the camera with both hands. He exhaled quietly, almost to himself, then looked back up. "I appreciate it," he said. His voice was steady, sincere, without hesitation. "But I already have a job." The room did not react right away, not because they did not understand, but because they did not expect that answer. Victoria's expression